All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks for being here in person. Thanks to those of you who are online right now. We have about five people joining us online. We have about, let's say 12-ish people in the room right now. Thanks all for being here. I'm glad you're here. This is the Mason County District Library. We have lots of programs like this. I'm glad you found out about this one and showed up to this. We have surveys on here. Please share your feedback. It helps us a lot to hear what you have to think about this program, what you liked, what you didn't like. Both are very valuable for us. We have questions on our papers for questions on the table. If you have a good loud voice and you can project, this is a good microphone that will be able to hear you if you have questions at the end. If you're a little quieter, just write your question on the paper and I'll read it into the mic for you. Either way works fine. Okay, we're looking forward to a good program. We're looking forward to good, thoughtful, constructive questions at the end. I'm going to introduce now my cohort, my colleague, Brooke Portman. Whoops, hold on a sec. Doing two things at once here. There we go. Welcome, Brooke. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for Brooke. Brooke, I'll let you take it away right here. Okay.
Thanks, Thomas. I also want to just do a shout out to Robin, who was a cohort in this crime. There are 3 collaborators. And thank you all, as Thomas said, for joining tonight. We want to thank first, of course, our funders, the Michigan Humanities, and then the Michigan Council for Arts and Culture. As I do every single week, and the closer it gets to tax day, the more this becomes very heartfelt, is thank you all for paying your state and federal taxes. Your state taxes get routed, some of them get routed to the Michigan Arts Council, and then the other, your IRS taxes to Michigan Humanities. So taking the time that a little bit, because we may have some newcomers and it's a kind of a complicated thing. Post-COVID world left us with complex problems. And Thomas and I had already done a series sort of during COVID that dealt with some of those issues of race and what was CRT and what was 1619 Project, and were they really what the news programs had said were. When we started to face the quarantine and COVID and all of those problems, they were even sort of worser, if I can use that. Broken systems, broken hopes. And we sort of thought that we needed to help people find their way. Not that in any of these sessions, but a point of view would be the approved one or the only right one, but that we wanted to provide a lot of information that then people can go ahead and make their own choices. But we do have as a commitment and a theme and a hope is that we all work toward what is a better world to each of us, that we put our shoulder to the boulder to do that. So as we thought about this and the complexity of all of this, and that we need to have expert presenters, we also realized that that the way to get through this, we need 2 things when we're kind of in this.
Sorry, that'll be right back. Just a sec. There we go.
Are we okay?
Yeah, we lost you for a second, Brooke, but we're back now.
Oh, good. All right. Anyway, so that we came up with, we need things that we can see in front of us. We need tasks that we can do. We can complete them. We can see whether they were good or bad. So we can see where we want to go next, and what tools do we need to do that. And we ended up calling that a cairn or cairns. Thomas is the hiker, and he was the one who came up with cairns and said, let's use this word cairns. And I said, I think it's a great word, but what's it mean? So we used it because prior to that, when I was doing some of the research, I said to Thomas, I think the word beacons has got to be in our title, because I kept looking at these big ideas and looking at new goals and new places we could reach. And that's when he called me and said, what do you think about Cairns? I thought, I love Cairns and beacons. And then that's how we got into, okay, so Thomas, tell me what a Cairn is. And it was perfect, just perfect. So we've got this sort of squirrel kind of, you see only what's right in front of you. And then we've got this lion or whatever who can see far. And that's Cairns and beacons in this title. We also knew that people were essential. And we kept saying between us is that there are people and resources all around us. So none of us is alone in doing this. Also, as part of that, we made 2 innovations to public lecture series, kind of ordinary thing, right? Well, we think we've made some innovations, and one in always having a discussion that follows a week later. More than we have Q&A tonight. We have that every time we have a presenter, but that's more formal, and it's not a kind of conversation of local people. And so the next week, which will be back again on our Thursday, will be with people who've participated here and want to talk about the ideas. The other thing that we added to the discussions is we include art, because art can help us understand what happens to people through various policies and programs, whatever they are and whatever period of time they're about. So we have found them pretty useful in unraveling problems or in looking at possible solutions and their outcomes. Thomas and I had from the beginning, and I'm saying Thomas and most of this right now is because Robin wasn't a part of this yet. She joined the library when we were probably about maybe 6-9 months into doing our research. And so at this point, Thomas and I talking back and forth. So we from the start, we had this improve the world thing, but we were quite conscious that, as I sort of said at the beginning, that we didn't want our point of view, but we wanted to have a lot of ideas and have a lot of information that people could then improve the world themselves. So we were on our way. We were eager to do this work. We were doing the work. We were researching. We were talking about the ideas. We were arguing about them. Well, okay, we've got 10 ideas. We've got to get it down to 8. Which one are we going to kick out? Those kinds of things. And then we got to a point where we were so deep into it, and we had this commitment of making the world a better place. But he and I arrived at a question about at the same time, which was, we're so busy right now. We're putting the series together. We have our families. We have other aspects in our community that we want to still be a participant in. How can we add anything more to our lives to make things better for the community? We just don't have time. And slowly, as we continued to work, of course, we found other, readers and writers who said, step by step, you get there. Brick by brick, Jane Addams. You get Rebecca Henderson in Reimagining Capitalism, a pebble in an avalanche of change will do it. It can destroy, whatever's in its path as much as a boulder can. Be that. And so we thought, okay, let's get back in and really believe that we can help make change. So in a moment of honesty, I have to tell you that I did ask myself, did I really believe that? So for a little while, I wasn't sure, but I kept on. I have to say, I was just not sure. What I'm sharing tonight is, much to my surprise, I found out that it was actually so in my life, and I want to give you this little track and see what you make of it in your own life. In the past, when I present each night the introduction, I have some kind of new version of a step by step. And maybe it's a more eloquent whole paragraph from Howard Zinn, who does push everybody's stuff forward. or a poem from Mary Oliver, who's always about, a new day and also making things better. But what happened, the universe works in its own ways. I suddenly found myself back with the two poems that we read in the discussion session after Michael Tomofsky was here, where he talked about making things better for the people at the bottom of our economic system and those up through the middle. Somewhat related to what I think that Paul will be taking us through tonight. Anyway, it did, Michael's book of Middle Out was also part of what the Biden administration did base its economic policy on. But the poems were about people who were poor. And one was by Douglas Dunn, American writer. Very touching, moving. Both of them were moving. One was Vachel Lindsay, Scott's writer. But about the effects of poverty on a family. They were moving out of an already poor neighborhood into yet a poorer place, and clearly going to be more crowded. As I sat there and reread the poems, I thought, my shoulder is angled into the wind differently than it did when I first read these poems and when we first discussed them at the session. And I had to sit there and think and go, why am I actually so into these poems? Why are they so pulling at my heart and my being? And then I began to go through where I've been probably the last couple, 2-3 weeks, making contributions here, small one here, small one, another small one there. Again, another one over here, talking perhaps to somebody a little differently than I had before. But I realized that not only were these things repetitive, I was not going to stop doing them. I mean, I realized that they were kind of a part of me all of a sudden. And then that's when I realized that I hadn't kicked anything else out of my life. I didn't have any more time than I did when Thomas and I had our conversation many, many months ago now about not having time for anything more, not being capable of putting anything more into my schedule. When I did it. I am doing it. Small things. I do have a feeling that it will continue to take over more. But I said to myself a version of that I share tonight that applied to me, which was I counseled myself, Brooke, you don't have to change the world, just change yourself. Earlier today, when I shared that with Thomas, he said that's sort of a Buddhist notion. And I suppose it is, but, humor me a little bit and it'll be sort of mine, but it works. And we'll each find our own way to make the world a better place with no more time, no more energy than we already have right now. So now specifically tonight, I want to turn to our speaker. First, I have to say is that this is a second part of a two-part mini-series within our series. So we looked at the Republican Party last month, and we are now looking at the Democratic Party this month. They are a little different terms in both their focus. Last month's was the local party here, because we were able to get the director of the Republican Party, new to the job, and she provided a lot of insight into our into the politics here. So it's with my pleasure. You can see Paul Pierson on the screen as I talk about him right now, but it's with great pleasure that I introduce Paul Pierson. He's professor of political science at the University of California at Berkeley. But politics isn't Paul's only field. Economics is equally his home. So in addition to his position as professor of political science, he also directs the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative. It's a pleasure to share with you that Paul has a fine published, including 7 books. He's sometimes the sole author, and for others, collaborated with one or other authors. Both are approaches that are exciting for us as readers. To give you a brief sense of his work, His titles include, and I don't know whether you can read the bookshelves behind him, but he's got some of those books there. We were able to see that earlier when we spoke with him this afternoon. Winner Take All, which was a bestseller. American Amnesia, which he spoke about actually last year when he was with us with Shifting Landscapes. Let Them Eat Tweets. It's a lovely, wonderful book and a great title. And coming out in September, his 8th book, Partisan Nation. The presses that have published his works are impressive, so I want to read them. Simon & Schuster, Princeton University, Yale University, Brookings Institution, W.W. Norton, Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press. Can't get better than these, right, folks? At the University of Chicago Press will publish his newest book coming out in September. As I mentioned, Paul did present for us on Shifting Landscapes and was one of our most favorite speakers of all 20 speakers. So we think you will enjoy his presentation and find him both engaging and provocative. So please join Thomas, Robin, and me in welcoming Paul Pierson. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, Thomas, can I get you to let me share my screen? Okay, got it. All right. I wanted to start just by thanking Thomas and Brooke for that really wonderful introduction. And I guess this is more what I was going to offer today is a little more like a 30,000-foot view. It sounds like for the Republican Party, you got the on-the-ground view, which is, I think, it speaks to people in a kind of immediate way. And what I've been doing, along with Jacob Hacker, who's at Yale, and a couple of students we've been working with, is trying to make sense of what's going on with the Democratic Party nationally. And I want to just note at the outset, I'm going to try to be relatively concise. I think Brooke said I could have 50 minutes or something like that, but I'm going to try to keep it shorter than that because I would really like to have time to hear your questions and discuss this. I know that these are issues that are really on people's minds. What's going on with our democracy? What's going on with these political parties? I was thinking as I was getting ready for this. So this morning I talked to 300 Berkeley undergraduates. I teach the big Introduction to American Politics class. And one thing that I always struggle with in that class is I feel like it's very hard for these 18-year-olds to have any sense of how wild our politics has become, right? How different things feel now than they did even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 or 30 years ago. I talk to them sometimes and say, well, when I used to teach this class, I used to say certain things that I don't feel like I can say with a straight face now. And there are all sorts of things to talk about now that would not have been, I don't think anybody could have imagined January 6th until very recently in our history. So it's a fraught time to be talking about this, and I'm happy to be talking with, I can't see most of the audience, but I'm guessing for most of you, this isn't your first rodeo. You've seen a few elections, and so how unusual these times are. And I'm happy to talk some about the election with you all at the end. But I do in this project, we do try to kind of zoom out and think about what's been happening to the Democratic Party over say the last 10 or 20 years, and how it's evolving and the kinds of challenges that it faces. Because parties are critical to the health of a democracy. I mean, Americans tend to be pretty down on parties. We think they're so partisan and we don't like that. But I think political scientists would universally agree that you can't really imagine democracy without political parties, right? You need these organizations to give people some sense of what their choices are and what will happen if they choose one thing rather than another thing, and who to hold accountable in politics. And in a world that is as noisy and complicated and confusing as ours, it's just really hard to imagine ordinary citizens being able to do that without having political parties to give us some way to kind of cut through all the overwhelming complexity. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't worry about the way those political parties behave, especially if they're in a mode of what seems like just deeply, deeply entrenched partisan warfare. But you can't really imagine running a democracy without political parties. So we need to try to understand them. But so again, so this talk is going to be a little bit zooming out from the election, although I think some of the things that I'll say will be relevant for thinking about what's going on for the election. And I'm sure we'll come back to that when we have time for discussion. But why the Democrats? Jacob and I have actually spent about the last 20 years mostly working on the Republican Party and the evolution of the Republican Party. And we decided really around the time of the 2020 election that we wanted to do something different and that we wanted to spend some time studying the Democrats. And I do think, particularly in the wake of January 6th, that this is a really important topic, that Democrats, for all the limitations that the party has, have emerged as a key bulwark of American democracy, protection against the risks of democratic backsliding, the kind that we did see in the aftermath of the 2020 election. And so the ability of that party to compete effectively in elections is really a critical question for the health of American democracy. We put it in italics here on this slide. If you don't have a successful center-left party, and by successful, I don't mean they have to be dominant, but that they're able to successfully contest a lot of elections, you're probably not going to be able to sustain a multiracial democracy. And another reason to think about the Democrats, we think, is that we believe that there are a lot of cliches and a lot of very soft thinking about the Democrats. People criticize the party from every direction. It's not that the party doesn't deserve criticism. All mass parties, if you're trying to form a coalition that's roughly half the country that you need to support you, and of course you hope it's a little bit more than half the country, that means you're going to have a lot of people who are going to disagree and who are going to fight and who maybe actually are not that thrilled by some of the people who are in their coalition. That's just a natural part of politics in any two-party system. But a lot of the things we think that particularly the media likes to say about the Democrats, we think actually reflects some pretty soft thinking. So we're trying to dig a little deeper, and I'll explore a little bit of that with you tonight, and then we can talk about it. So just here's a quick slide. This is about what's happened to the left in Europe. The share of the vote for social democratic parties, which traditionally have been the strongest parties on the left in most of Europe. And you can see since 1990, these parties have really declined. Like it's been a very hard period for the left and the center left in many countries. You can see a little bit of a rise of the radical right. So some of the things that have happened in the United States with the emergence of Donald Trump as the key figure in the Republican Party, you can see echoes of that in a lot of parties in other countries as well. But a pretty stark decline in the left. And of course, that actually hasn't happened to the Democratic Party in the United States. It's a mixed record electorally, to be sure, but Democrats have actually won the popular vote for president in 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. Right? 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. Now, they haven't held the presidency after all 7 of those elections because twice they won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. But there's actually been no period in American political history where a single party won the popular vote in 7 out of 8 presidential elections. So it's actually in electoral terms pretty impressive record. If you look at the United States Senate, the Senate is highly biased towards small rural states, right? I show a slide to my undergraduates that shows that Wyoming, there are 2 escalators in the state of Wyoming, and there are 2 senators in the state of Wyoming. So you have representation in the Senate by geography, not by population. But if you actually look at how many voters does each senator represent, right? How many voters are there in their states? How many citizens and voters does each senator represent? Republicans have not had a majority, have not represented a majority of American voters since 1994. That was the last election where they've controlled the Senate about half the time since then, right? But Democrats have represented more voters in the U.S. Senate. Democrats and independents who caucus with the Democrats, like Bernie Sanders, have represented more American voters than Republicans in after every election since 1994. So electorally, in many ways, Democrats have done pretty well in terms of reaching voters. And they've done that even as the party has changed quite a bit in ways that I think that are pretty interesting that we need to pay attention to. And there are three quick changes that I want to talk about. Two of them are shown on this slide here. Hope you can see it. But basically what it shows is that Democrats back in say the 1990s, they represented many more voters who had low incomes than voters who had high incomes. High income voters tended to favor the Republicans. But Democrats have become a party that's actually economically quite diverse. It carries most of the richest congressional districts in the country have Democratic representatives now. And so you have this kind of interesting kind of U-shaped coalition where very low income voters and high income voters are in the Democratic Party coalition. A lot of rich suburbanites, for example, are in the Democratic Party now. Professionals, college educated voters have drifted from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. So it's now this kind of U-shaped economic coalition. And of course, it's an increasingly multiracial coalition, right? So the Republican Party is still pretty overwhelmingly white. 81% of Republican voters in 2019 polling were white, but only 59% of Democratic voters were white. So a multiracial, multi-class, if you want to use that language, coalition. And also increasingly geographically, the Democratic Party has lost ground in rural areas and picked up ground in metro areas, especially in suburbs. And so what this slide just shows is compares two elections, a bad election for Democrats and a good election for Democrats. The 2010 election was a very bad election for Democrats. That was the Tea Party election, Obama's first midterm where Democrats, I think he called it a shellacking. I can't remember which presidents called their first midterms by what term, but I believe Obama called it a shellacking. Democrats lost 63 seats in the House in the 2010 election. But what this slide shows is that overwhelmingly the seats that they lost were in rural areas, right? Either kind of like outer suburbs that are on the edges of rural areas or purely rural areas. That's where a lot of those seats were in the South. Democrats really lost a lot of ground in rural areas. And then in the 2018 election, right, which was Donald Trump's first midterm, and of course, Donald Trump would never admit that he'd experienced a shellacking, but he did in the 2018 election. Republicans did in the 2018 election. And you can see there, Democrats picked up a lot of seats, particularly in the suburbs in that election, right? So they didn't pick up rural seats. Right? They've really lost their ability to compete in rural seats, but they've tremendously expanded their capacity to compete in a lot of suburban areas. And so you have what we would call a metro coalition now. So it's multiracial, multi-class, and mostly tries to span to try to bridge between urban areas and suburban areas. So what we want to try to do is to figure out how this new coalition works, and what this change in the Democratic Party has meant for what the Democratic Party tries to do. And in many ways, we take off from journalist Ron Brownstein. Some of you may know his work. He's an analyst on CNN. He writes for The Atlantic as well. I think one of the very best political journalists in the country, maybe the best political journalist in the country, certainly the best, I think, at kind of thinking about like big long-term trends in American politics and how they translate into, the very fierce political competition that we see between Republicans and Democrats today. And Brownstein likes to talk about contemporary American politics by saying Republicans are the party of restoration and Democrats are the party of transformation, right? So Republicans, in many ways, so make America great again, right? It's actually a pretty good slogan for capturing that idea of like, we want to take things back to the way things were, right? That is a platform, a line of attack, a political attack and rhetoric that resonates mostly with voters that are older than average, that are whiter than average, increasingly voters who do not have a college education. Republicans have done increasingly well, especially with white non-college educated voters. Democrats, on the other hand, have assembled what Brownstein calls a party of transformation that includes a lot of younger voters, voters of color, professionals, college educated voters who feel like the changes that are taking place in the economy, the rise of a knowledge economy, shifting away from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy, they feel like this is a world in which they can economically advance, right? So they're more open to this idea of transformation, an urban metro coalition as well, not a rural coalition. So I think that's broadly right, the way that Brownstein describes this, if you just want kind of a simple label. But the one thing that we would substitute is instead of talking about the Democrats as a party of transformation, we would say that in their contemporary form, they're reasonably described as a party of incorporation, right? So there are a lot of people who have been on the outside, perceive themselves to have been on the outside of American politics. This is about race. To some extent, it's about gender. Democrats increasingly has more women voters. Republicans a party that has more male voters. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. These groups that have been excluded also see the Democrats as being more welcoming. So Democrats are a party that is trying to incorporate a lot of these new groups, but in support from a lot of relatively privileged voters as well, especially in the suburbs, right, where you tend to see people who are economically better off, right? And so this coalition of incorporation, what we would suggest is it opens up a lot of potential tensions within the party, right? There are a lot of potential divisions over race and ethnicity, over income and wealth, over gender, over age, whether you're a homeowner or a renter, whether you live in the suburbs or in the core of the city, whether you're an immigrant or whether you're native born, all these potential tensions playing out in this party, right? And so the question is like, can you make that work, right? Can you make that work? And what we're trying to explore in the book project that we're working on and some papers that we've been writing is how this coalition of incorporation has been trying to manage the tensions within it. And in exploring this, we've looked at what a lot of journalists have written, not just about the Democrats, but about left of center parties in other countries as well. But journalists have written, what scholars have written, and discovered that there's some interesting generalizations that you tend to find people making about the Democrats and about other parties. And we've actually found some things that we think are surprising to go along with that. So as I already mentioned, across the Western world, left of center parties have been facing really a lot of electoral headwinds. They've not been doing as well electorally. There's a lot of research suggesting that left of center parties are going to be more divided They're going to have a harder time holding their coalition together. The standard argument for that is because a lot of Democrats come from these very, very blue urban districts that are going to be quite left, that it's hard for them to join in a coalition with districts that are more moderate. Will Rogers, the comedian Will Rogers, had a famous line about the Democrats back in the first half of the 20th century, where he said, I'm a member of no organized political party. I'm a Democrat. You know, and at the time that really fit with a lot of the conventional wisdom about the Democrats. There's an old saying like that Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line, right? Democrats, they fall for a George McGovern or a Gene McCarthy or something like that, and the party's in disarray. Republicans, they get with the program, they go with whoever the person is who's supposed to be next in line to lead them. And so there's this expectation that Democrats are going to be a lot more divided. There's an expectation, and this is really held up in Europe. This is based on research by Thomas Piketty, the French economist, that says that as these left-of-center parties have started to rely more on professionals and educated voters who have higher incomes, that they're going to become less progressive on economic issues. They're going to moderate on economic issues because they're not going to want to alienate these new voters. And instead, they're likely to pivot towards identity politics. They're likely to become woke in the language of today, right? Because on those cultural issues, there may be more commonalities between their rich voters and their less well-off voters. I'm going to skip over this last point, which I would talk about if I were going to go longer, but I don't want to go longer. So what about all these expectations about the Democrats? Well, has the Democrats' electoral performance declined? No, I've already pointed that out. They won 7 out of the 8 last popular votes in presidential elections. Are they more divided than the Republicans? I think the evidence is pretty clearly, recently, I'll talk about this more in a minute, that they haven't been. Have they moderated on economics? I think that was a true story. Certainly people in Michigan, I think, would recognize it as a true story for the Clinton years, right? And probably into the Obama years. But it doesn't seem to be a true story about the Biden administration. The Biden administration and Democrats have turned to the left on economic issues, which is, I think, puzzling to many observers. And so we've been trying to figure out why that's gone on. Have they pivoted towards identity politics? Our answer to that question would be not really. Although there's a lot of media attention that suggests that they have pivoted away from economic issues towards cultural appeals, kind of left-wing cultural appeals. We don't actually think that that's what the evidence bears out. So I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute. So I'm not going to go through all of this stuff today. I just want to focus on 2 questions. Have Democrats been in disarray? That's a kind of famous cliche headline that you would expect to see in a newspaper or online somewhere. Democrats in disarray, right? And have the Democrats gone woke? And I'm not going to have time to talk about all the elements of this, but I want to say just a little bit about it to give you a sense of just maybe questioning a little bit some of the cliches that I think a lot of people carry around about the contemporary party. All right. So first of all, this idea that like Democrats fall in love or maybe fall into argument with each other as the party divides. Republicans fall in line. So this was a big thing in the early 2000s. And when George W. Bush was in the White House, congressional Republicans, leading congressional Republicans, not surprising, all of them white men, young white men who presented themselves as kind of the future of the Republican Party, up and coming, big ideas guys in the Republican Party. So that's Kevin McCarthy and Eric Cantor and Paul Ryan, right? All 3 of these guys are now out of Congress. All 3 of them taken out by the right wing of the Republican Party, right? Even though all 3 of them quite conservative, right? Quite conservative guys. but we've just gone through the episode with Kevin McCarthy, but he's not the first. And John Boehner was not a young gun, but you could put John Boehner in this photograph as well as somebody who was a leader of the Republican Party, who was basically taken out by his own troops. And then on the other side, you had Nancy Pelosi, who just went on and on. Nancy Pelosi is the second longest serving party leader in American history, right? And she had some big setbacks along the way, right? So she was Speaker of the House when that 2010 shellacking took place. But Democrats didn't throw her overboard, right? She was able to hold on to her leadership post, held on to her leadership post all the way through to 2022, right? And then Democrats, without anybody raising their voices, handed off that leadership position to a new generation, to Hakeem Jeffries. There was no real fight over that leadership transition. And so I actually think, this line about how Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line, probably needs to be changed now. We probably need to think about that in a different way, even though there's research that suggests that often left parties are going to be the ones that are going to face more internal divisions. It has been, and we can talk in the Q&A about what's going on with the Democrats now, because certainly in Michigan, I know you guys are aware of the divisions that are emerging in the Democratic Party. But if you take a long view, if you go back from the 1990s all the way through 2022, it's the Republican Party that has faced acute divisions, with the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus, which has really made life hell for its own party leadership. And the repeated jettisoning of leaders, Gingrich, Hastert, Boehner, Ryan, McCarthy. We'll see how long Mike Johnson lasts. Already there are people in the Republican caucus who are saying, one or two mistakes, and we're going to take him out. So it's pretty striking over the long term that the Democrats have also had more success in holding their caucus together in order to pass big, important legislation on close votes. Republicans, they succeeded with the Trump tax cuts, but that was about it that they were able to do. So now I think we might want to say something more like Democrats fall in line and Republicans fall apart. I mean, it's just really striking to see how sharp the divisions have become on the Republican side. Why might that be the case? Why do Democrats, because of course Democrats disagree about all sorts of things, right? Strongly. There are big differences between the moderate wing of the Democratic Party in Congress and the Progressive Caucus. And there seem to be a number of factors that are at work here that I just want to mention quickly. First of all, there is pretty good evidence just from public opinion polls that show that Democratic voters are more willing to compromise. They're more supportive of compromise than Republican voters are on average. So if you ask voters, do you think it's more important for a leader to stick to their guns or to compromise in order to get something done? And Republicans and Democrats give pretty different answers to that question. Republicans are much more likely to say, stick to their guns, right? Stick for principle. Democrats are more inclined to say, half a loaf is better than none, right? And going along with that, again, not surprising, if you ask Democrats and Republicans about their party leaders, Democrats are much more positive about their party leaders over a long period of time. Republicans often start out strongly in support of their leaders, but with the exception of Donald Trump, they get pretty disappointed with their leaders pretty quickly, right? In part because those leaders have to compromise, right? And so, pretty quickly, Paul Ryan, John Boehner, Kevin McCarthy, they become quite unpopular. Mitch McConnell, they become quite unpopular with the base of the party. And again, Democratic voters, they may not like some of the things that their leaders do, but on the whole, they seem willing to accept that compromise is going to be part of the game. Now, one reason why that may be true is because I think the media ecosystems that the two parties are dealing with are very different from each other, right? So, and I have a slide. I'll just show this really quickly. And I'll explain what this is. So, it's just asking people whether they, whether they trust, whether they consider a particular news source trustworthy or very trustworthy, and what percentage of voters do that. And Republicans and Democrats almost completely disagree about what sources of the news are trustworthy. But Democrats find a lot more sources of the news trustworthy. Basically, there are just a couple of sources of news that Republicans trust. So even though I do think there clearly is left-wing media in the country, but and there's other research that points to this, that there's just a broader media ecosystem that kind of spans from the moderate center left to things that are further on the left. And Democrats tend to consume a lot of those different media sources. So they're getting different messages from different places, and they seem to be okay with that. Whereas Republicans, it's a much more kind of narrow casting situation where there are just a few sources of news that they trust that are, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence now, especially about Fox News and the way that it has pulled the Republican electorate towards the right and has made life miserable in many cases for people like John Boehner and Paul Ryan. And the media just doesn't seem to play the same kind of role in the Democratic Party. I think another thing that has helped Democrats stick together recently, at least recently, the last 10 years, 8 years, is Donald Trump. I think that opposition within the Democratic Party to Trump is so intense that people are often willing to rally around candidates. I think this is clearly part of Joe Biden's success in 2020, the way that he was able to bring the party together in 2020, join forces with Bernie Sanders supporters who very strongly favored him. And for a while, it looked like there was a very good chance that Sanders would get the nomination. But everybody came together after the primaries were over. And I think Donald Trump's presence, the desire to not have him be president, has been an important source of glue. And I'm going to skip over this point about elite incentives, except just to say one thing, which is that I think Democrats tend to be much more interested in legislating than Republicans do, for a variety of reasons. Like, they want to pass laws. They want to get that half a loaf. And in order to do that, you have to be open to compromise, especially in the American system with the Senate being heavily skewed against the Democratic Party because of the way that it overrepresents rural states. You've also got the filibuster you have to deal with in a lot of situations. So I think Democrats just recognize that, given that so much of their agenda actually requires legislation and that it is incredibly challenging to legislate in the American political system today, that they're more willing to compromise than to cut their leaders some slack. All right. So that's a quick treatment of this first question about whether or not Democrats are in disarray. And I think, of course, there's a certain amount of chaos in any large political party, and there may be more this year than we've had in the recent past. But when you compare the two parties, it's actually the Republican Party that has had the most internal disagreement, that has given its leaders the hardest time, and so on. And Democrats, really, I think there's been a surprising amount of willingness to compromise and cohesiveness. Okay. What about this second question? Like, have the Democrats turned woke? And here are just a couple of quotes, right? And a couple of headlines. The Democrats' privileged college kid problem. Democrats cater to the woke at their electoral peril. And then a line from David Lenhart, who writes in the New York Times: the social liberalism of Democrats has simultaneously attracted progressive college graduates and repelled more culturally conservative working class voters. And this, I think, is just like the standard view now of the Democratic Party. It's what you hear in the media over and over again. And I don't want to say that it's completely wrong, but I think it is at best a tremendous oversimplification of what is going on in the Democratic Party and what the Democratic Party is trying to do. And so we've looked at this a couple of ways, with a focus on like what Democratic politicians actually talk about and what they actually try to do when they're elected to office in Washington. And you can see on the left here, I'll show you the little bit on the right in a second on a slide where it'll be a little bit easier to see. But the Democratic platform since 1980 very consistently has given about half of its platform to economic issues, right? And that's changed essentially not at all in 40 years, right? There has been a little bit of an increase in identity and social cultural issues, stuff that they talk about in the platform. But the increase is not particularly large. And it's not, it has not come at the expense of a focus on economic issues. You read a Democratic platform, you're going to see a lot about the economy. And then we did this other thing, thanks to having these very clever and skilled students who know how to work with big data in a way that Jacob and I don't. They were able to canvass millions of tweets, right? Elon Musk has now made it impossible to gather this data, but it used to be that you could go to Twitter and scrape away at it and figure out what all the tweets that came out of Democratic and Republican members of Congress, the leadership, Schumer, McConnell, Pelosi, Paul Ryan, and so on, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. You can collect all this and figure out what they're talking about, right? And what you see here is that the Democratic leadership, overwhelmingly, they are not tweeting about cultural issues, right? They are not tweeting about woke things, right? They are tweeting about economics, about their Build Back Better plan, about the Obamacare, the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure law. The only cultural thing that shows up on the list of top 10 things there from the leadership is Roe v. Wade, right? And I think that's pretty understandable. And actually, I'm sure if you collected Twitter data on this now, I'm not going to call it X. If you collected Twitter data now, you would find the same thing. You'd find that there was probably more attention to abortion because that's become a much more visible issue. But overwhelmingly, they are not tweeting about cultural issues. They're tweeting about economics and about how they're trying to make economic life better for working families in the United States. It's the Republicans who are tweeting about cultural issues, right? Sleepy Joe Biden, the fake news media, and so on. They tweet much less about economics. And one thing that I think is interesting about looking at this Twitter data is if you were expecting Democratic leaders to be using a lot of cultural rhetoric and woke rhetoric, the place you would really expect it to show up would be in their tweeting, right? Because that's mostly going to be reaching a pretty young audience, college-educated audience, like especially exactly the kinds of people where a lot of the journalists say this is who the party has become, and they're not actually doing things that are going to speak to the economic needs of ordinary Americans anymore. But just in terms of their rhetoric, I just don't think that the evidence bears that out. And we also have data on individual members of Congress, including members of the Progressive Caucus, so sort of the left wing of Democratic members of Congress, and you see exactly the same thing. It looks almost identical. They are also not tweeting about woke things. They are tweeting about economic things. They're tweeting about what Brooke was talking about earlier. It's great that you had Michael Tomasky speaking to you, right? This idea of kind of middle out economics. That's what they are trying to communicate. That doesn't mean that they're effectively communicating about it, right? This doesn't tell you anything about the kind of media coverage that they're getting, but it does tell you what they want to be talking about, what they're trying to talk about. All right. And so I'm going to skip over the rest of this pretty quickly, but I just want to stress that it's not just the Democrats in Washington were talking the talk, right? They actually really did try to focus their agenda in 21 and 22 on economic issues. Most dramatically in the Build Back Better plans. Originally it was the American Family Plan and the American Jobs Plan. By far the most ambitious economic agenda of any American president since at least the 1960s, right? You have to go back to the Great Society to see an economic agenda as ambitious as what the Biden administration and their congressional allies tried to pass in 21 and 22. Now, and hugely redistributive as well, right? It was going to, exactly the opposite of what you would see in the distributional effects of the major Republican proposals when Donald Trump was in the White House. Both their tax plan and their healthcare reforms looked almost exactly the opposite of this. But if the even slimmed down versions of the Build Back Better plan had been passed, it would have meant a really noticeable shift in income away from top income groups and towards moderate and lower income groups. And a lot of redistribution built into it. The effort to make the expanded child tax credit permanent, right? If that had succeeded, just that one piece of this ambitious agenda, it would have reduced child poverty in the United States by 40%. Right? 40%. So a very ambitious economic agenda. And as we know, the record was quite mixed in terms of what happened with that economic agenda. Important legislation passed, the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed, the CHIPS Act passed, a very slimmed down version of Build Back Better. Basically, the things that Joe Manchin would agree to, right, were able to pass the Senate. So that was mostly, in the Inflation Reduction Act, that was mostly some improvement of healthcare subsidies in the Affordable Care Act, and some really important climate initiatives, right, to try to advance the transition to a less carbon intensive economy. So those things passed. Most of the other things didn't, right? But almost all the Democrats in Congress supported these initiatives. We've done a lot of interviews. You usually do them over Zoom, but we've talked to a lot of high up people in the Democratic Party, Congress, White House, think tanks, activist groups, labor unions, and it pretty clearly emerges out of those interviews that they had 48 votes in the Senate for the House version of the Build Back Better plan, which wasn't everything that Biden had wanted, but it was a lot. It would have been, quite an impressive achievement in such a narrowly held Senate. But of course, with Joe Manchin and to some extent Kyrsten Sinema holding out, they weren't able to get those provisions through the Senate. But there's just very widespread support among Democrats in Washington for a much more ambitious economic agenda. Let me say just a little bit, and then I'm gonna start wrapping up. I want to say just a little bit about how they managed to pull this off, of getting as close as they could, as they were able to get to passing this kind of agenda. Because again, remember, there's this idea, not an unreasonable one, that now the Democrats are trying to appeal to all these affluent suburbanites, they actually won't be able to pursue a progressive economic agenda. They'll really have to scale back what they're doing. And what we found is what they did, in fact, was to realize that they could actually bridge the blue divide, hold the coalition together pretty well by focusing on economic issues, as long as they were really careful about the kinds of things that they pushed for, right? And I would say they did two things that were very important. One was they didn't do anything to jeopardize, threaten in any ways the circumstances of suburban America, right? They didn't. There's a lot of interest, I think, among people who are critical of income distribution in the United States, who say, suburbs are able to kind of hide from everybody else, and protect their resources in suburbs and not share. And there are people who criticize that. Democrats were not interested in doing anything that would potentially make suburbanites feel like, they're coming for your zoning laws, or they're coming for your school districts, or anything along those lines. So they're careful about that, because that would be very divisive for their coalition, and unpopular for many of their voters. And the other thing they did, which is actually just in some ways just reflects how much income inequality there is in the United States right now, which is that Biden was able to say, and Democrats were able to follow through on this, we're going to pursue all these very ambitious economic programs, right, that are going to involve big new initiatives for childcare, for housing, for healthcare, and so on. We're going to pay for all of it. We're not going to borrow, right? And we are not going to raise taxes on anybody who makes less than $400,000 a year, right? So everybody making less than $400,000 a year, they were either going to be beneficiaries of these programs, or at least they weren't going to lose anything, right? Because their taxes were not going to go up. That's pretty extraordinary that you could do that, you could make that kind of a commitment. And you can only do that because there's enough, especially after the Trump tax cuts, reduce tax rates that have gone down for corporations and have gone down for very high income individuals. So you can raise a lot of revenue if you push those tax rates back up a little bit, but you can basically exempt everybody making less than $400,000 a year, which is something like 98% of the American electorate. They're all going to be untouched by these kinds of proposals. So that potentially makes managing this coalition and developing economic programs a lot more sustainable than we might think that it would be, given the diverse nature of the Democratic coalition. All right. I'm gonna skip over this last slide because I basically just talked about it. I'm just gonna say one word. Still bring it in under 50 minutes. I'm just going to say one word about 2024. I'm sure a bunch of you are going to want to talk about 2024. And again, the purpose of our project is to zoom out a little bit and think about kind of the long-term evolution of the Democratic Party, and how it has sought to try to maintain its viability and be electorally competitive as it continues its movement towards becoming a party of transformation, or a party of incorporation, if you like that language. Got to say that a lot of this is not carried over, even though it's been successful for over the long run. I'm sure you're all aware of what Joe Biden's polling numbers look like as we move further into 2024. Views on the economy, which political scientists always say are really important for deciding elections, are surprisingly negative, I think, given a lot of key economic indicators like unemployment, inflation, the stock market, productivity growth, job market growth, wage growth, particularly in the bottom 60% of the income distribution. A lot of those numbers look really robust by historical standards. They look really robust compared with the numbers that are being generated in any other major economy in the world. By those standards, the current economy looks really, really quite good, but that's not showing up in the polling numbers at all. There's some evidence that voters are starting to feel a little bit better about the economy. That doesn't mean that they're feeling better about Biden. And I would say there is very little evidence. I think the Biden administration and Democrats hoped that if they passed this legislation, if they did things that, for example, were going to help to boost manufacturing employment, that they would really reap some significant political benefits from that. I don't think there's actually any evidence that is happening so far. There's still some time to run before November, but I would say, but if Democrats are looking for those kinds of effects, they're running out of time. There's also a lot of evidence that voters are just generally unhappy. I was looking the other day at the General Social Survey, which is a national survey that's done year after year, just tapping people's attitudes, many questions that don't have anything to do with politics. And one of the things that struck me was that beginning with COVID, it's probably not that surprising, but it's just interesting to see some hard data connected to this, that beginning with COVID, that the percentage of Americans who said that they were unhappy, pretty unhappy, or very unhappy went way up. Right? After 25 or 30 years where it was basically as stable as could be, right? Other things went up and down, but that answer to that basic question, how happy are you, was very stable for 20, 25, 30 years. But in the last 4 years, people are much more likely to say that they're unhappy, right? So if you're an incumbent, that's not what you want to see when you're running for re-election. And then, of course, you guys know all about this in Michigan. There are emerging divisions within the Democratic Party. A lot of those are generational, right? I think there is a lot more disillusionment with Democrats in the Biden administration among young voters than there is among older voters. And of course, this question of Gaza and Israel and its impact, particularly in key states, is a huge issue. I'll just say, frankly, when October 7th, in the aftermath of October 7th, I had a hard time convincing myself that this was going to be a voting issue for people a year later. There's just not that much evidence in American politics. It's very rare for foreign policy issues to achieve that kind of significance in presidential elections. But I think we have to consider now we're close enough to the election. The election is likely to be close enough that disaffection with the Biden administration around foreign policy issues, could be really costly in November. Okay, so covered a lot of ground. I've got some time. Would love to hear people's thoughts, questions, and I'll stop at that point. I don't know if you guys remember this. Jeb Bush, during his short-lived and disastrous Republican presidential campaign in 2016. This was probably the low moment when he was giving a talk and failing to generate any enthusiasm, and he begged the audience to clap for him. You don't really need to do that since we're all on Zoom, but I look forward to your questions.
Or if somebody has one they want to shout out, I think we are.
Hi, my name is Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Tom.
Okay, I'm shouting out. My question is, you mentioned that the Democrats are generally well informed in the media. They have a broader view of media than, say, the Republicans, who seem to focus on Fox and various other minor right-wing media outlets. I was wondering, when I listen to mainstream American radio, not so-called radio on the internet, all I hear is mostly 90% right-wing talk. Since the decline of Rush Limbaugh, his death, seems like it's fractured, etc., but it's still prominently right-wing is the main representation on public radio. Could you comment on why that is? Why are there no liberal networks like there used to be in the 2000s, one called Air America Radio with various celebrities? Continue.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, Tom, and you're absolutely right. Sorry, my phone messages are blowing up. They should hopefully they'll stop in a second. So there is a complete asymmetry on talk radio, and talk radio is a powerful media source. it more or less has always been true. Like I remember Air America. I actually remember I was on once being interviewed by Al Franken a long time ago before he was in the Senate, back when he was on Air America. But they always had a very small audience. And so talk radio has always been really a conservative outlet. And I think that's I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that I think the main audience for talk radio is older folks, generally older men who are driving around in their cars. And that's a Republican demographic on the whole. So that's part of it. But the other part of it, I do think, and in some ways it speaks to like some broader features of our politics, is that talk radio is an angry medium. Like it is a medium that really feeds on anger. And not that there isn't like anger on the left, but I don't think there's kind of a media culture of anger that really resonates with people in the same way that it seems to on the right. So the one kind of media niche that is disproportionately left is political comedy, right? So you have things like The Daily Show or the Colbert, which did attract really significant audiences. But the tone of Stephen Colbert was very different, right? The tone of, I'm not saying, I mean, he had his strong political views, but it was all done with this kind of ironic quality to it, rather than pounding the table kind of quality to it. And there really is not much in the way of right-wing political comedy, right? That doesn't seem to work very well either. So it's just kind of interesting that right-wing spaces seem to fit well with talk radio, and left-wing spaces fit better with this kind of comedic thing. But talk radio is a huge deal. It remains, even without Rush Limbaugh, it remains a big deal. It is overwhelmingly hard right, like not even moderate right, but hard right. But in some ways, it reinforces the message that I was trying to send about the media, which is that there is a lot of like highly partisan, narrow casting in Republican media. And I'm not saying that there aren't, that we talk about whether there's liberal bias in mainstream media and so on, but there's just a much wider political spectrum that's represented, and most Democrats seem to be okay with sampling from a variety of different sources, rather than just basically saying, if it's not this one outlet, then I don't trust it.
Go ahead, Mary.
It seems as if the Democratic Party has a problem with Kamala Harris. What are we going to do about that? Or what is being done, or what can be done?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I would say, I mean, I would back out from the question and say, well, they have a problem with Joe Biden,
Yes.
right? I mean, that's, so, and the problem with Joe Biden, I would say the basic problem with Joe Biden is that people see him as being too old. Right? There are other issues as well. It carries over to some extent to policy issues, which we could talk, and there are a bunch of them we could talk about. Inflation, even though inflation has come way down, and again looks pretty good if you look at it cross nationally. I think it really steered people. The high inflation rates really steered people and shaped people's thinking about the Biden administration. Immigration is a big issue for people, right? And Biden administration, I actually think understandably, there's a lot of unhappiness about where we are with immigration, and with the Biden administration's record on immigration. But I think the biggest single problem is that he's perceived as too old. And it's interesting. I would say interesting that that Trump doesn't seem to be perceived as too old, and that a lot of that, he seems to have what I would call a younger affect than Biden does. Like, he looks more energetic, right? But it's not at all clear to me that mentally he is more energetic, more mentally on top of things, right? That seems a lot less clear. But this isn't. We're not going to do IQ tests for these guys. Perception is what matters for voters. So Biden does have these deep problems. His approval ratings are quite bad by historical standards. I think we have to get used to the idea that presidents are not going to have the kind of approval ratings that they used to have, because you really can't expect, in our polarized politics, you can't expect to hold on to any support from the other party, to have the other party approve of you. But even by the standards that we've gotten used to, his approval ratings are really bad. So they almost certainly need to improve if he's going to be reelected. But then there is this question, like, there are really two. If you think like Biden is in deep trouble electorally, and I think it's reasonable to think that, then there are two questions, like, who would you replace him with? What would they do better? Okay, so three questions. And like, how do you do that? Could you replace them with somebody without blowing up the party, right? Without activating all these divisions. And I said a lot in this talk about how I think Democrats have actually done a pretty good job of managing their divisions over the last 20 years or so. But the divisions are there, right? Inevitably, there are going to be divisions in a big coalition. And the other side is going to do whatever they can to try to activate those divisions. So that's where Kamala Harris comes in. And of course, she doesn't poll well. But can you step over she is, from a kind of, I don't know, institutional perspective, she would be the obvious replacement, right? She's the vice president. And she's not old. She would be the obvious replacement. And so if you think somebody else would have a better chance of winning, boy, I just think it's incredibly challenging to figure out how you essentially replace a Black woman, right, with some other candidate. So I guess there's a very long way of saying I agree with you that it's a problem. I mean, I do. I guess I will say, so I live in California now, so I've watched Kamala Harris for a long time, and I don't think she's a highly skilled politician, but I don't think she's a terrible politician either. I think being vice president is not an easy job. Not an easy job to come across well in. Most vice presidents don't come across particularly well. And so I think there is a bit of a puzzle about why she polls as badly as she does, and whether that might change if she actually were at the top of the ticket, whether people's very low expectations at this point might be exceeded by what they actually experienced when they interacted with her. But I think it's I think this idea of if you really did decide that somebody else would be better than Biden, which I think is not obvious, actually. It's not obvious to me that there's somebody out there that you could actually nominate who would do better. Like, it's easy to imagine it hypothetically, but I don't think the answer to that is obvious. But how you would get there, by having Biden step aside and then not turning to Kamala Harris, I think it's just extraordinarily difficult political problem.
Can I follow up with that one?
Sure, go ahead.
So do you think that Biden has not been as generous with Kamala as Obama was with Biden in the sorts of things that he has allowed her to get involved with?
I do kind of think that. I do kind of think that, and I don't, it hasn't been central to our research, so I haven't, it's not something that I've like, when we do these interviews, that I've asked people about very, very much. But it is sort of, it's striking. So forgive me of like a sports analogy. I'm a big Golden State Warriors fan, and there's this thing that happens in basketball games when the clock is running down, the 24-second clock is running down, and you have to get a shot off, and somebody will like throw it to somebody else at the last second, and they have to like throw up a Hail Mary shot that has no chance of going in, but it's like somebody's throwing you a hand grenade and you've got to get rid of it. And it kind of feels like, for reasons that I don't fully understand, that Harris has gotten a bunch of those. Right, that she's got, immigration being a prominent example. But she's gotten some sort of 24-second clock is running. We have no chance here. You deal with it. And Obama did not do that with Biden. And I don't have some kind of like deep knowledge about why it seems like that has been the dynamic. But I think it probably has hurt her. I don't think it's probably the fundamental reason why her polling numbers are bad. But it certainly hasn't helped.
Go ahead over here.
Yeah, Paul, question I have is, going back to the poor polling numbers that Biden has had, his vulnerabilities because of his age and the economy, whether it's deserved or not. And that, of course, makes an incumbent vulnerable to a newcomer because they can always say, well, I can just do better. Now, that normally, to me, works when the newcomer is an unknown because they're kind of a blank slate. But, which Trump was in 2016, but now we know what a raging asshole he is. and or more to the point, what danger to democracy and national security he will present if he's reelected. So he's not an unknown entity. So I'm not so much interested in Trump's, the hardcore Trump voter who will always vote for Trump, but these other voters that are disappointed in Biden, like, do they really think voting for Trump will actually be better? Or are they undecided? Or I'm trying to understand how this is, because the choice is very stark in this election.
It's a great question. So I just say, one thing to begin with, I mentioned, I'm teaching these undergrads and I have a hard time explaining to them how crazy things are, right? Because they don't really have anything to compare it with. And one thing that I've said to them a couple of times is like, it used to be the case that if you were a sitting president and you lost when you ran for re-election, you like dropped through a trap door and you were never seen again. Right? Like Jimmy Carter or, George Herbert Walker Bush, it's like you lose and like you were dead to the party. Like, forget it, right? And so it's a striking thing. It's a sign of like how much our politics has changed that, Trump could kind of just like dust himself off, and especially given everything that he had done, and become the instant front runner again, and now kind of juggernaut, right? So a lot of things have changed. Like something's changed in the water, right? To produce a pretty different kind of politics. So you're right. There's 35% of the electorate that thinks Donald Trump is great, and they're happy to vote. They're happy to vote for him, but he needs a lot more people than that to vote for him. And it's striking that Haley is able to pull 25 to 30%. Given that he is clearly the dominant figure like that. But that suggests that there are, leaving aside independents, that there are a lot of Republicans who don't like Donald Trump, right? This is an insight from Ron Brownstein. It's not original to me, but I think it's really astute. If you look at the 2022 election, where Democrats did surprisingly well, right? And part of the reason why they did surprisingly well what part of the reason it was surprising was because Biden's approval numbers were pretty low then. They're better than they are now, but they were pretty low then. But what Brownstein pointed out was that that typically, when you ask voters, do you approve of the job the president has done? And it's like strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, strongly disapprove, right? That's the way it's broken down. We usually just hear approval, disapproval, but it's actually 4 categories. Typically, historically, somebody who said that they somewhat disapproved of the president's job performance would vote for the other party, right? But in 2022, the majority of people who said that they somewhat disapproved of Joe Biden's job as president, they voted for the Democrats anyway, because they didn't want to vote they didn't want to vote for MAGA, right? So particularly in states where that was on the ballot, right, when there was somebody, Pennsylvania or Arizona, or these places where there was a MAGA candidate on the ballot, right? People who somewhat disapproved of Biden voted for the Democrat, right? And so the question is, so you put Nikki Haley together with that, and you think, okay, well, there probably are a bunch of people who might vote for the Democrat, even though they're not very happy about what's going on, right? I would say that is still Biden's best hope, right? I don't think he's going to convince people to radically change their views. At the moment, you see this in the polling. I read this yesterday. Donald Trump actually has a higher approval rating than he's had since early in his term, right? Higher approval rating than he's had in 6 or 7 years, right? And I do think some of that is short memory, like that people don't remember things. And so, I think the Biden administration, their hope is that people will start to pay more attention as the year goes on, and there will be a more active campaign, and that they will remember what they didn't like about Donald Trump, and that Biden will go back to pulling a significant share of the vote from disaffected Republicans and from independents who don't want Donald Trump. I mean, another way to put that, and then I'll stop, is I think if the Republicans were running Nikki Haley, she would probably crush Biden, right? She would win by a lot. Donald Trump, a lot of people in the country really, really don't like Donald Trump.
Thank you.
We have one more in the back over here. Go ahead.
We're having to go out and campaign in the very near future here. And you were saying that the Democrats, when people were tweaking, that Democrats way outnumbered the economic issues versus the economic issues for the Republicans. Now, I know you did a presentation to the Republican Party, or members who came, I don't know how many came, but how was that, when you presented those statistics to them, how were you received?
Oh, Paul
I
did
didn't.
not do a presentation to the Republican Party.
Oh, you didn't?
Yeah.
I'm sure they would have loved. I'm sure they would have loved this presentation. Yeah, I didn't. But I think I get what you're getting at. And I mean, I'm sure the Democrats, I'm sure the people in the Biden administration are pulling out what hair they have left, because they feel like they have had a good economic record. I think a lot of the data really backs that up. And especially backs it up if you situate things cross-nationally, which of course most voters are not going to do. Like the inflation that happened in the early part of the COVID period, that happened everywhere, right? That was not a U.S. thing. Compared with other countries, the U.S. actually did pretty well in managing inflation and bringing it down pretty rapidly. But but you're not going to get any credit in an election for that. But but a lot of the economic numbers look really good, and I think the Biden administration has good reason to feel like they have tried very hard to make economic life better for ordinary Americans, for working Americans. They have tried very hard, and that they have actually accomplished quite a bit, given how difficult it is to legislate in the U.S. So I'm sure they pulled their hair out over this. But there just is, I think, no evidence in polling that suggests that their efforts have reached voters. Right? And some of that, most voters are not paying that much attention. They just, most people are not that interested in politics. I mean, you guys are here listening to this talk. You're weird, right? I mean, you're not normal. Right? No, I mean that in the nicest way. Like, but you're not like most voters are not doing this, right? And so things like the fact that he was a businessman, that Trump was a businessman, right? Resonate, and they've forgotten things like, people didn't like when Trump folks passed their tax plan through Congress. People did not like it. It was not popular. People saw who was getting the benefits from those tax cuts, right? But that was a long time ago. That was a long time ago.
Well, I was amazed. I serve on the canvas board. Okay. So I was amazed at that I think just about every single precinct in Mason County had between 5 and 10 undecided voters. And I thought that was incredible. I mean, there were candidates on there, like, Chris Christie was on there, 0 in any of them. Nowhere did we see his name pop up at all, that people had voted for him. Did they just forget that there were other alternatives if you were a Republican, other than Haley and Trump, or how did that play out?
I mean, it is extraordinary. I mean, his ability to consolidate, and again, it's an important thing in thinking about the general election. The fact that Haley is pulling, given that it is so clearly a referendum on Trump at this point within the Republican Party, the fact that she is able to pull 25% of the vote in many states, that's an important data point, right, for thinking about the general election. But it is extraordinary the way that Trump has consolidated support, and so you think back. So like one thing I think there are a couple of things that I would emphasize about that. One is people don't like cognitive dissonance. Like people don't like if people have been supporting Trump for a long time, which most Republicans have by this point, they are not going to be very open to arguments that say, he's a grifter, right? And he's lying to you, he's ripping you off, whatever. People they are not going to be very receptive to that message. And then so January 6th, in the aftermath of January, so Mitch McConnell just announced he's stepping down as leader, right? There was that brief period, right? There was potential for a different Republican dynamic in that period when it looked for a few days like McConnell was ready to push for removing Trump from office. And maybe if he had come out in favor of it, maybe they would have gotten, things would have tipped differently. And they would have said, we've got to get rid of this guy. We're going to be done, right? But then McConnell kind of counted heads and decided, maybe he didn't have 17 votes to do that. And so he stepped back. And so the party started to, at that point, the party had to push back, right? If they were not going to jettison Trump in that way, they had to push back against all the accusations against him. And then the second piece of that was, which I think is really interesting to think about, is when the indictments started to come down, right? So DeSantis, who turned out not to be a great candidate, but if you go back and you look at the polling, you can go on like 538.com and see like what the, what support has been on the Republican side over the course of the last couple of years. DeSantis was polling reasonably close to Trump. Like, I think, 60-40 or something like that. And, where you could have imagined, it going a different direction. And then the federal indictment started to come down. And very quickly, the party rallied around. Like you can see, there's like a clear inflection point. Trump starts to go up, and DeSantis starts to go down. And I'm sure that played out in the media as well, and in right-wing media, that there was kind of consolidation protection around him around the same time. So, again, so, you have to, when you get these situations where it's my guy or them, right? And then, so I think Trump, very much, he tried to make it like it's about rallying around me. And so 70% of the party has done that.
I would love to keep talking all night. This is a fascinating topic, and Paul, I'm glad you're here to talk about this with us. But I encourage everybody to come back to the discussion on the 14th of March. So a week from Thursday, we'll have a discussion on the same topic here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for the great questions. Really, really enjoyed it.